Welcome back. At the end of the last lesson, we discussed the importance of incorporating accessibility into your first round of development. I cannot stress this enough. Accessibility is not a secondary task that you come back to after your app is working. It is a primary concern that needs to be addressed as part of your development process. In this course, I decided to keep it separate for educational reasons, introducing one concept at a time and building upon those concepts incrementally. We now have the conceptual groundwork laid out to add in our accessibility features. We will go over what I consider some of the very basic accessibility concepts that you need to keep fresh in mind when developing forms. These concepts are technically not view-specific, but we will learn how to apply them in the context of our view form components. Let's dive right in. Let's take a look at using appropriate types. In HTML, we have a wide variety of input elements to craft our forms, but one element in particular rules them all. The catch-all input allows us the flexibility of creating text inputs, but we can also transform it into checkboxes and radio buttons with the type property. A common mistake is to ignore this type property when creating text inputs. Most of us know and commonly use two regularly: type email and password. When using a specific type in an input element, not only do we get better autocompletion for our form, but it also allows screen readers to better understand what type of data we want to retrieve from the user. A type of tel, for example, will provide the user on a mobile phone with a handy numeric keyboard with phone symbols like plus, asterisk, and hashtag. Your users with mobility problems will definitely be grateful for this one. Bottom line, don't forget to set your type, even when the input is not of type password or email. Here you have a list of available types for an input element. Let's now move on to the use of field set and legend. Two often overlooked or undertaught elements in HTML are field set and legend. In forms, usually we group our inputs logically. For example, you would usually code your form to first ask the user for their personal data, like name and phone. Later on, another section may ask them for a shipping address. For accessible users, this information may not be as immediately available without having to tab through the whole form. This is where field set and legend come to play. You should always try to wrap up sections of your form inside a field set element. This will logically group the inputs inside of it. Then, the first element of the field set will be a legend element, which will provide a title for that particular field set. If for some reason you do not want the legend to show on your form, usually because of some design reasons, you can always position it absolutely outside of the visible screen. For our current form in simpleform.view, we can wrap up our logical sections inside field set as follows. Let's take a look at simpleform.view in VS Code. I'm going to add a field set element. Inside, we are going to copy the two inputs and the h3 tag. This h3 tag will now become a legend. Let's do this one more time. For the event section, I will cut the inputs and the h3 tag again, and it will become once again a legend. Let's do this one more time for the pet section. I will copy once again the h3 and the div into the field set, and you guessed it, the h3 becomes a legend. One more time for the extras. We create our field set. We're going to cut the h3 and the inputs, paste it inside, and switch the h3 for legend. One more thing though. I want to go back to the pets section. We are going to replace the legend with pets. And the "Are pets allowed?" question I will put in a p tag to better signal what we expect from the radio buttons. Finally, we can scroll all the way down and add a style tag. We will remove the default borders and margins. First, we will add a field set tag and set the border, margin, and padding to 0. Next, we can style the legend. We will set some values here for the font size of 28 pixels, the font weight of 700, and the margin top of 20 pixels. This will make the legend tags look as our previous H3 tags. We can now go see this in the browser. I'm going to be using Firefox this time because it has a very nice accessibility inspector tool. If we go and check the accessibility tab, you can now see how the logical grouping of our form will be understood by screen readers. We're getting 4 groupings, each for one that we just created, and you can see that as I hover over them, they get highlighted on the left with purple. Each of these groupings represents one of our field sets. Our next tip is do not rely on placeholders. A popular design pattern that emerged a few years ago used the placeholder attribute of inputs to describe the type of content that the element was expecting. Sadly, this is still sometimes used nowadays instead of a proper label. Placeholders should only be used to describe the intended value, but not as a replacement for a descriptive label. Placeholders disappear whenever a user starts typing into the field, forcing the user to keep in mind what the field was expecting. Additionally, some users can have problems differentiating between a field with a placeholder and a field that has a pre-populated or filled content. As far as screen readers go, each screen reader may treat the placeholder attribute a little differently, but as long as a correctly set label is in place, it shouldn't be much concern to leave it in. Let's talk more in detail about labels. A really powerful accessibility feature that is sadly very commonly underused or misused in forms is labels. If we navigate here to Firefox again in the Accessibility tab and inspect our title input, let's take a look at the information panel. The check section is already telling us the issue. Form elements should have a visible text label. This may come as a surprise since our title field clearly has a label on top of it describing what we intend for this input. For our sighted users, however, this is not evident. We have not yet linked these two HTML elements together, and that is an assumption that a screen reader cannot afford to make. Thankfully, this is a very easy fix. There are a few ways to link an input element with its label. The first one is to actually nest the input inside of the label element, like this. This is one of the easiest ways to make sure that your input is always correctly linked into the related label. But I want to go into detail into the second and usually more common way to relate HTML elements because it will come in handy later when we look at error messages. This method involves using IDs. Let's jump directly into our base input component and figure out how to create a relationship between our label and our input by using an ID. You may be thinking that perhaps the most obvious option would be to add a property so that the parent can determine the ID of the element, and then we don't have to worry about it inside our component. And you would be right. But what if there was a way we could dynamically generate unique number identifiers for every component in our form without having to resort to manual props? We are going to create a Vue3 composable that allows us to create dynamic unique identifiers, or UUIDs for short. I know this is a bit of a jump from the pace of this course, but if you need a refresher on Vue3 Composition API or composables, we have a course titled Build a Gmail Clone with Vue3 here on Vue Mastery that will get you up to speed. At any rate, don't worry too much, it's going to be a really simple one. If you're following along with the repository files, I've gone ahead and created a uniqueid.js file inside the features folder. Let's take a look. First, we declare a let variable with a default value of 0. This will increase as we create more and more components. The first component will have an ID of 1, the second of 2, and so on. We are going to export a function, uniqueID. When executed, this function will return an object, which contains a function under the property getID. This function will increase by 1 the global UUID counter and then return it. Know also that there are plenty of UUID libraries out there that you can use in place of this custom solution, but I wanted to show you just how easy this can be. Let's look at this in action to better understand it by looking at base input.view. First, we are going to import our new composable. Import unique ID from features unique ID. Now that we have it ready, we can generate a new unique ID inside our component's setup method. Let's go ahead and add the setup method here and declare a constant of UUID. We will call the unique ID method and the getID method inside. Notice that we are executing both the unique ID composable and then the getID method inside. This will give us a completely unique ID number every time the component is instantiated. Finally, we return an object with a UUID so that we can use it in our template. Speaking of which, let's go back into the template and tie the label and input together. To accomplish this, we need to give the input element an ID attribute value. We will bind the ID to our UUID. After we have the input set up with its own unique ID, we can now tell the label that it's describing the input by setting the for attribute of the label. Please note, all of these are vanilla HTML attributes. There's no crazy view magic here other than the ease of binding all of them. Let's head back to the browser. The first thing I want to point out to you is that the warning sign on our field is gone. And if we check under the bit where it says relations inside the accessible properties, we can see now that it shows a new entry labeled by title. If you hover over this element, you can now see in the browser which element exactly it's referring to. Neat, right? Now, if we take a look at the Inspector tab and we look at our input elements, we can see that they have automatically been assigned IDs 1 and 2 respectively. We still need to add a UUID to our checkbox, radio, and select components. Are you up for this challenge? Try doing this bit yourself. It will be as straightforward as replicating exactly what we just did here with the base input. Let's talk now about accessible errors. Have you ever filled out a form just to hit the submit button and nothing seemed to work? It was clearly not submitting and there was no visible error anywhere, yet something was clearly wrong. This situation is not foreign to most internet users, but imagine the exasperation when you require accessible tools and the form doesn't easily tell you what's wrong with your inputs. Let's go into our base input.view component and add a new prop, error. This will allow us to set a string with an error message in case the component is in an error state. It will be a type of string and a default of an empty string. We will display this error below our input field whenever an error is present. So if the error property is set to anything other than an empty string, we will check this condition with a BF and we will add this class of error message so that it shows red. Finally, we interpolate error on our p tag. We will also go back to simpleform.view and add a demo error message to our title input so that we can see how it behaves on the browser. Let's add our error property and it will read, "This input has an error." Now let's look at the browser. The error is correctly displaying under the title once the error prop is set. Note that the description input, which is also a base input component, is displaying no error because the prop error is not set to anything. If we open our Accessibility tab in Firefox once again and inspect the input element, we can see that there is nothing tying the error to the actual title input. This is where most forms fall short. Just because the error message is near or close to the input doesn't mean that a screen reader will be able to identify it as part of the error. Luckily for us, there is a straightforward solution to this problem: the ARIA described by attribute. This attribute allows us to declare directly on the input element which other elements describe it. The attribute can take a string list of IDs for other HTML elements in the page. So first, we're going to add a unique ID to our label. Luckily, we already have a UUID number associated with the instance of the component to be able to do it. Let's head back to base input. We are going to add an ID binding to the p tag. Notice that we're appending the -error string to the UUID. We need this identifier to be unique, and the UUID by itself is already in use by the input. Now that our error message has a unique ID, we can set it as the description for the input element with the area described by attribute. Notice that we are adding a secondary check to see if error is set. This allows us a bit of a relationship hygiene between our elements. When no error is present, no error message will be displayed and the ID will point to nothing. If we check our browser once again, we can see that when the error is present, a new described by entry is present in the inputs relationship object. Notice that when we hover over it, it also gets marked in purple on the browser. One more thing though, because we are using BF to display this information on and off, we want to make sure that screen readers announce or read it whenever it becomes displayed. To do this, we are going to add an attribute of a11y assertive. Another way would be to add a role attribute of alert, but I've found that a11y tends to work better with a variety of screen readers. Let's navigate again to our base input.view and let's add an a11y attribute here on the p tag with the value of assertive. Let's now talk about explicit input state. Yet another thing we can quickly add to our input to make it even more accessible is the aria invalid attribute. A mistake that I've seen many forms make is to try and rely on a red border around an invalid input. For obvious reasons, this is not accessible. We've taken already steps into accessible errors, but let's make sure to also notify screen readers on the invalid state of the input to provide better feedback for our users. We are going to add the aria invalid attribute to our input and toggle it off and on depending on where the error property is set. When the input is valid, null will make it so that the attribute is not added to the input element. Let's go back to our component baseinput.view. Add the new aria invalid attribute binding to the input element and we will check if there is an error, it will be true. If not, it will be null. If we go back to the browser and inspect the input using the accessibility tool on Firefox, we can see that the state of invalid has now been added to the active states of the input. Other noteworthy states that we could also add attributes for are read-only, disabled, and required, displayed on the left. These three can be set directly with HTML5 attributes of the same name or with their aria counterparts on the right: aria read-only, aria disabled, and aria required. One more tip: do not disable the submit button. If a form is valid, then it makes sense to set the disable attribute to true on the submit button so that the users can submit the form, right? We can even style the button with a different color to convey that it won't be clickable. There is a big problem with this though. Users that rely on screen readers will not get any feedback at all. The button will be completely ignored by the screen reader when tabbing through the form. This clearly can be very confusing and frustrating. I suggest instead that you make any and all checks to make sure your form is valid before submitting it on the send form method that we created on the simple form component. If everything checks out, we submit the form normally. If something is wrong, then set the necessary errors in your forms with the tools that we just learned to notify the user that something is wrong. Please note that this is pseudocode and these methods don't actually exist in our code. As you can see, with a few quick lines of HTML and some strategically placed properties, we managed to turn around our base input component into something a lot more accessible. I do want to stress though, that as far as the topic of accessibility goes, this only begins to scratch the surface. But with these few tips, you should be able to set the course for more inclusive and accessible forms for your projects. Thanks for watching.